Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon, and today we are looking at a big discussion about the rotation that was announced not too long ago, and it's going to be from Primal Clash onward for the new standard format as of September the 1st. So as you can see, the sets that we will be losing are XY, XY Flashfire, XY Furious Fists, and XY Phantom Forces. So we're going to be going through a couple things here. We're going to be looking at what we're actually losing, the most important cards that we are, having to say goodbye to. Then we're going to move on to what decks are literally completely gone, will be no longer. Think about things like Night March. Basically, we lose all the Night Marchers, that deck is gone. No questions asked. From there, we'll compile a short list of the decks that are still around, that are either surviving, thriving, or just adapting archetypes. So the decks that have been at the top of their game, top tables, most recently, we'll be looking at how they will be affected post-rotation. And finally, we'll be looking at a few opportunities for some fringe decks which have never really come to light so far, but maybe post-rotation in a slightly different format, these decks could be a little bit more worth considering. So, firstly, let's have a look at what things we're actually losing. I've stolen this little handy grid here from Complexity Card Gaming's website. It's a very informative, good website. It's relatively new as well. It's collaborated some of the best European players that we actually have right now. And Benji, he actually made an article about the rotation himself. I've been looking at a lot of other videos and trying to gauge some sort of analysis from these other people before getting into my own one to try and get this big mega video sorted. So thanks, Benji. I've nicked your thing there, but I will leave a link in the description below for Complexity Card Gaming. It's a very professional, nice-looking website. They do more than just Pokemon as well, but Pokemon's the most recent thing that they've started to get involved with, so definitely a website to keep your eye on for good competitive Pokemon analysis. But let's look at the cards. This is pretty much a short list of the most important Pokemon, and then items, supporters, stadiums, and tools, I guess, that you can see on the right side. So just a few notable ones. Trevenant XY is going. Trevenant's huge, obviously. Greninja as well from XY leaving us. That slightly hurts Greninja deck. Aromatisse, it's sort of half rotated itself recently. It's not been too popular, but that's something that we lose. Couple of the highlights, we're losing Lucario EX. Seismitoad EX is obviously humongous. I think this is one of the biggest losses that we are having. Alongside the Night Marchers as well, which is of course a big one. We are losing Manectric and Mega Manectric EX, one of my personal favourite archetypes in the past. That will be leaving. Also Bronzong, the Metal Lynx style decks with all the different attackers. We do lose Aegislash EX as well, and also Dialga EX is going. But, if Bronzong's gone, basically you can forget about all of them because the whole deck is functioned around Bronzong. So those are the most important Pokemon. And then there's loads of important trainer cards that we're losing as well. Xerosic and AZ are notably huge. They've been put into a whole bunch of different decks because they are very versatile, very powerful supporters. We are losing Battle Compressor, probably the most important item that we do lose. Obviously huge for certain decks, like Vespiquen decks. That we still have Vespiquen, but without Battle Compressor, who knows if it can survive, if it can get Pokemon into the discard pile quickly enough with just the likes of Ultra Ball and Professor Sycamore. Who knows, only time will tell. But personally, I think it's a lot weaker. Looking down the list, we also lose the Headringer and Jamming Net. It was a really cool mechanic that was introduced. I'd love to see it get reintroduced at some point. Tools that interact with your opponent's side of the board. I think it's something that Pokemon don't do often enough. Cards that affect your opponent rather than your own setup. These sorts of tools were pretty original, pretty cool idea, and they were useful throughout their lives, basically. Definitely Headringer was, Jamming Net less so, but even then it shone in a few specific decks, so pretty cool cards. Sad to see them go. I'm personally sad to see Focus Sash go as well. I thought that was a very cool mechanic in a tool card. Super Scoop Up is one that's been in and out of the format since the very beginning of the game, so there'd be no surprise if we see it come back around at some point, but for now it's out of the format. A couple other interesting cards we're losing. Robo Substitute was big for hit and switch style Pokemon. You can see that we also lose Gengar EX and Mienshao, so there aren't really any hit and switch style Pokemon left in the format anyway. I guess you could argue Marowak is, but Marowak's never been good, and all the fighting stuff that goes just make Marowak even worse. So yeah, Robo-Sub pretty much not used anyway too much at the moment. Maybe stuff like Groudon would be sad to see this go. But yeah, some interesting cards. Another huge one, of course, Dimension Valley. It was huge for Trevenant and Night March, but they're both leaving anyway. But at the same time, look at things like the Mew, which is sometimes been thrown into decks where you're trying to have a boxy style with different EX attackers and just make them cheap because of Dimension Valley making Mews cost one less. That's no longer an option for us. So pause if you want to look at the full list, but I've got a few general things that I would like to talk about in terms of what we're losing and how these losses will change the format in a general sense. So tool removal and tool disruption is gone. So that means that Garbodor is actually very, very powerful right now. As soon as you get Garbotoxin set up, it is pretty much set up all game unless he is Lysandered and knocked out. You actually have to deal with the full Garbodor, not just deal with the tool these days. So that's very strong, and it's a huge bonus for Garbodor style decks. And it could spell danger for any ability focused decks as well. Also, the likes of Fighting Fury Belt is much, much bigger. It doesn't have to compete with Muscle Band anymore, so Fury Belt is the go-to option. And if people can't get rid of Fighting Fury Belt, it is very, very strong. Plus 40 HP, plus the 10 extra damage buff is absolutely huge. So I imagine Fury Belt is going to be a go-to option. Quick note on Bursting Balloon as well. That gains quite a bit because people have far fewer outs to get around Bursting Balloon. It was really only in Trevenant where we saw Bursting Balloon take full effect. I know a few Greninja players have used Bursting Balloon, flirted with it in the past, but now that there's no Megaphone and Zerosig, potentially Bursting Balloon could have a chance to shine all over again. And another note with those Headringer and Jamming Net, EX decks can be much safer, not having to worry about Headringer. And it also is a bit of an issue for energy denial decks. Headringer was once a great option to make your energy denial approach a lot more effective, because if they are running EX decks, it's an extra energy that they physically have to attach to attack in the first place, which gives you more time to find your energy denial cards, but that's no longer an option. So a lot of the interesting tools are going, and tool removal is gone as well, so that does change the dynamic of the format pretty much in a huge way. I think this is one of the biggest things that we're going to be seeing differently, that tool removal is gone pretty much. Also, item lock. There's only one real way that we can item lock people these days, and that's Vileplume. And Vileplume's only ever going to be in very niche type decks where the whole focus is Vileplume. One thing that made Seismitoad EX, I believe, the best item locking Pokemon since I've ever started playing the game is because he's potentially splashable in so much, just because of that double colorless energy cost. You can punch at any point in the game, and until Pokemon Ranger came out, there was no way to stop being Quaking Punched for a turn. You could only be retroactive, trying to get rid of the energy afterwards, but you knew that for that turn you were definitely item locked. So seeing Trevenant and Seismitoad both go is huge. It opens up doors for so many different things. We haven't seen effective Stage 2 decks in forever, because there's been 3 decks that can item lock you. So Rare Candy is pretty much not an option, therefore Stage 2s aren't really an option, for the most part, of course, with the exception to things like Greninja and anything with Forest of Giant Plants, I guess you could argue. But yeah, with a lot less item lock, potentially we can start seeing some Stage 2 decks come back into the format, which I'm very excited to see. If it does take that turn, of course. I'm not necessarily saying that it definitely will, but with less item lock, a lot of these things open up. You can have more intricate, more setup-based decks, because you can assume that you're going to have items for the majority of the game against a lot more matchups. Obviously, that could mean that Vileplume becomes a much more popular archetype, but it's had to compete with these other item locking decks, but now it is the sole reason to play the deck is just for item lock alone, then you're stuck with Vileplume, basically. Another interesting interaction in a more general sense with Battle Compressor is that these engines have been so consistent for so many decks, where you can throw a few tech supporters into the discard pile, you can have 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe one of supporters that you want to have at the right situation. So by having 4 VS Seeker and a few Compressor in your deck, you can search out these things a little bit more easily to use them in the right situation. But now that Battle Compressor goes, it's going to be interesting to see the balance between tech supporter and straight up draw support. Especially it's going to be interesting to see how many VS Seekers continue to see play. VS Seeker in its early stages was not too popular. It was only really when compressor decks started getting huge where it became a staple for. Obviously there are decks right now that aren't playing any compressor that do still play full VS Seeker, but it's sort of a cultural thing that just you see these decks with full VS Seekers, maybe with no compressor in format. We're going to see more physical support accounts, and these tech ones maybe 2-ofs rather than 1-ofs, going back to more traditional things like 2 Lysander. I remember when Lysander was first released, it was always a 2-of pretty much if you're playing it at all, because you need to have access to it, and when we don't have compressor, you need to physically have these high accounts once again. Still on the compressor hype, Maxi and Archie decks take a huge hit from this. It's already pretty inconsistent in standard to try and get the Maxi and Archie going, but without battle compressor, it's pretty much never going to happen. So I don't think we're going to be seeing Maxi and Archie style decks in standard at all, pretty much, in my opinion. Next up is the sort of, we lose Super Scoop Up, we lose Cassius, and we lose AZ. So this is really huge. This is a really big deal because AZ and Super Scoop Up, for the most part, have been the most important ones. Trying to deny prizes by picking up things that would be targets on your bench. Think about Shaman EX is the most common example. You want to get the use out of Shaman EX, but then later on in the game it's a liability. It's a Lysander target to basically lose you the game a turn earlier sometimes. So you just AZ it up, Super Scoop it up, and you're safe. Additionally, sort of healing. You could heal with AZ, heal with Super Scoop Up. I know that was a common factor in the likes of Manectric bats and Lucario bats. For the same reasoning, picking up these types of Pokemon that you can spam abilities with, the likes of Alakazam and bats, most importantly, these are the ones that you would want to spam a lot of, so you'd want AZ and Super Scoop Ups in high counts. Well, that's not really an option for you anymore, so that's interesting indeed. And finally, just an overall statement is that Night March is gone, and Vespiquen Vileplume is probably going because of the likes of Karen being in format, and we don't have compressor, so it's a lot less easy for you to run through your entire deck. There's a lot more jank in the deck. You can't discard as many Pokemon, so the Vespiquen in particular is useless. We're probably going to see Vileplume variants take a turn in a different direction. So it's going to be interesting to see that. I know that it's been paired with some dragons before in the past, Latios and Giratina sometimes. Other attackers as well come into the fray. Now that Vespiquen is much less of a viable option. So what I'm trying to say is these were the pace setters of the format. They would go turn 1, they'd go nuts. They'd go absolutely crazy, get a huge discard pile and swing for big damage on the very first turn. And there's no real deck that can do that right now. I guess you could argue that Rayquaza is the most likely that you could do this. You could get a turn 1 where you are able to one-hit KO EX Pokemon because you do have the Ancient Trait that lets you evolve in the first turn without being punished. So you can go straight ahead with a Rayquaza and have a crazy turn. Remember, we do still have Max Elixir style decks where you can get multiple energy in the field on turn 1, so some of these attacks could be achieved from nowhere if you just hit elixirs at the right time. So it's not really a true statement that the format is slower, but these two were the most inherently consistent at getting turn 1s that were just out of this world. So there is a slight argument that the format is slowing down, and that's only natural because we're losing so many cards. We have a lot smaller card pool, but in particular Night March, it was known for having aggressive turn 1s and just being a turn 1, turn 2, turn 3 win style deck where you're trying to deal with an EX Pokemon every turn to win the game. We don't really have that in format anymore, and that's an interesting dynamic to see. So what I've done here is I've listed the US Nationals decks that I deemed to be the top picks just a few weeks ago, and I've, as you can see, crossed off some of the decks that are completely gone. Night March obviously rotates, the Trevenant is gone. Aquabox is probably no longer a thing. It was all based around Seismitoad EX for a start. Additionally, we do have Pokemon Ranger to help get around the likes of Glaceon and Regice, so that deck is pretty much dying. The Metal Box decks, clearly all based around Bronzong, they're going to be really neutered and pretty much useless. Vespiquen Vileplume, that is going. I would say that You need other Vileplume variants to remain relevant as the Vileplume player, but definitely the Vespiquen part and the way that that deck is built, which was probably the most consistent way you could build a Vileplume deck, that's not going to be relevant anymore, so that's really cool to see. Then we are also losing Mega Manectric, and Warlord Wolves was one I didn't discuss for US Nationals, but I thought I'd throw it in here as a bit of a discussion topic. Although Warlord's still around, we lose Cassius, we lose AZ, we lose Super Scoop Up, we lose Aegis/EX as well, which was important. We lose quite a few interesting cards. We lose the Durant as well, which was handy. We lose Trick Shovel if people wanted to play that. So there's a lot of losses for Warlord, and I feel like potentially it's not long until it can recuperate and kind of form a new sort of story deck where you're not trying to attack ever in the game, you're just trying to fatigue your opponent. I'm sure that style will be around at some point again in the format, but for right now, Warlord as we know it is completely gone. So, also we have to consider Steam Siege because the rotation is going to be in September, so we will have Steam Siege available. So, new introductions to the format. This is just my early impressions. I feel like these decks have viability and potential to be part of our format, so I'm going to discuss these a little bit as well in the analysis here. So Volcanion has a lot going for it. It's got really nice abilities, can do huge damage. It has that non-EX Volcanion, which I think is just an absolutely absurd card. I think it's very, very good. Mega Gardevoir has a lot of potential I'm a big fan of. Mega Steelix as well. It's one of these that could be absolute garbage, and I'm just wasting my time talking about it, but I think it has some inherent strengths. Xerneas Break is another one that fits into that category. I think it's going to be one I would like to test out, definitely in a slightly slower format. It seems like those sorts of approaches would be much more relevant and viable. We have Geomancy, we have Max Elixir, we have EXP Share, which can't be taken off anymore by the likes of Megaphone and Xerosic, so having high counts of all of these could mean that you can keep a lot of energy in play for the entirety of the game so that the break is constantly doing good numbers. And also there's Yanmega, which I know a lot of people are a fan of. It's very similar to Yanmega Prime of the past, and that saw play throughout its career pretty much, and it was very, 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 very good card. So there's no reason to think that the new Yanmega won't do the same. I'm personally a lot less of a fan than the Prime. But the Prime was an absolutely absurd card, so it doesn't really say much that it's less good than the Yanmega Prime, because it's still a pretty good card. So, taking away those decks that I crossed out because they were literally completely rotated, the Pokemon are gone, and then adding in these new ones from Steam Siege, we have this shortlist. You can see, you may notice that I also crossed out the Gallade part of the Yveltal Zoroark Gallade bit. That's like I was saying earlier, the Maxi style is not going to be relevant, I think, in the future. So we have this new shortlist, the new metagame that we have to start approaching, and basically I'm going to go down this list now and talk about the sort of strengths and weaknesses of the decks, what they gain, what they lose, new threats, all those sorts of things. So hopefully this will be handy for us. Firstly, we have Greninja. I put Greninja as surviving. It does lose quite a few cards. It loses XY Greninja, which isn't too big of a deal. It loses a few techie cards that it would sometimes play, the likes of Durant, Hard Charm. The Dene is a bit of an issue because Mega Rayquaza, a lot of people are hyping it to be a big deck, and Dedenne was often thrown in to improve your Rayquaza matchup, which before throwing Dedenne in is probably unfavourable. You do lose Sacred Ash, but of course we do have Super Rod anyway. And the biggest thing is that we lose Megaphone and Xerosic, like I was saying, no tool removal. So if people are playing Garbodor, that's an issue. You're going to have to Lysander it twice to deal with a Garbodor, because we don't have Muscle Band either. I should have actually put that on the list. So Moonlight Slash is capped at 80, so we somehow need to get an initial 20 onto Garbodor, or just, it's going to be impossible to deal with a Garb in one hit for a Greninja player unless you're playing Tex. So that's pretty awkward for you, and I don't know how it's going to get around this. It really does depend on how popular Garbodor is and how relevant he is. It may be one of these situations where everyone's aware of Garbodor, so no one's playing ability decks, and then people skimp out on Garbodor. It's going to be one of these up and down type trends where you're always trying to play around Garbodor. As soon as people start figuring out that no one's playing abilities, then you start skimping out on the Garb because it's not relevant. You want to have better mirror matches and stuff like that, so then there's space for these ability decks to come back in. It's one of these cyclical things that we have to keep track of, but for right now, it has to fear Garbodor at the very least. Then we do have Darkrai Garb. This sort of popped up as an anti-meta style deck at Origins just before Nationals. Although it didn't do fantastically well at Nationals itself, it's still a pretty powerful deck. It really doesn't lose much, just Zerosic and AZ, and this is just, you know, every deck loses these cards. These are the only things it loses, so there are a couple of new threats for the deck, but pretty much you can imagine the list is almost unchanged, which is very, very cool, because this was a powerful, fast deck that could handle a lot of different decks just by out-hitting them. A few new threats is that Pokemon Range is a card, obviously, so that can really ruin the Giratina style approach. Obviously, Giratina was thrown in oftentimes for Night March and other DCE based decks, and if Night March and Vespiquen are no longer going to be popular, there's a lot less uses for the Giratina in that regard, but Giratina is still going to be huge for the likes of Rayquaza EX and Mega Rayquaza, so I think it's still going to be thrown into the deck quite often. The biggest threat is going to be Fairy stuff. Giratina is weak to Fairy, and they also resist Dark, which is Darkrai EX and Yveltal EX and all of those sorts of cards. So if Garbodor Darkrai becomes the best deck in format, then these Fairy decks could start popping up in various forms. There's a few that I'll talk about later on, and not just Xerneas Break, but yeah, some of these could start seeing play as a nice counter pick to Darkrai Garb, which pretty much remains unchanged, so I think this is going to be a front runner going into the new format personally. Barely surviving is Vespiquen Other. I say barely surviving because Karen is always going to be around. If Karen is played in these sorts of decks, or a lot of different decks, then Vespiquen itself might have to just give way to Yanmega. Yanmega may become the new splashable grass type that wants to hit for weakness on certain things. That was basically Vespiquen's role quite often in this format, just to deal with the likes of Greninja and Seismitoad. Obviously Seismitoad EX is leaving, so there is no real need for the Vespiquen at the moment in format. In terms of losses, Compressor is easily the hugest one. So Fueling Bee Revenge is a lot more difficult. It becomes a very late game centric card, and at any point in that game Karen could screw you over. New additions for the deck is at least you get Special Charge, so streaming DCE is never an issue, and I guess you could play Yanmega yourself. Just play a Forest of Giant Plants build with a thick Yanmega line and a thick Vespiquen line. You have the Yanmega for reserving your energy and doing good damage, and then later on when the Yanmegas have gone down you can get a big Bee Revenge off. The plan is there, but you know, Karen can just ruin those plans. Next up is Yveltal Zoroark Gallade. I put it as adapting rather than surviving or thriving. I think obviously the Gallade is not going to be an option anymore. A few other losses is Druddigon. Druddigon was a nice one-of that we saw in quad Zoroark decks, and I believe that's the way the deck will turn to. Zerosic AZ as well. We lose Target Whistle and Muscle Band, but at least we can replace Whistle with Captivating Pokepuff as the techie one-of type thing that you throw in to try and increase your Zoroark output and get some more EXs on the board for easy prizes. We also do gain, of course, Ninja Boy with Umbreon EX, so you could have decent matchups against other Megas, and it looks like there are quite a few important Megas in the format, so Umbreon might start becoming a tech in these sorts of dark decks, because it can just give you really favourable prize trade, which is cool to see. Yveltal is just an inherently powerful deck. It has splashable options. You have Zoroark. You can even play Garbodor if you want. Instead of playing Darkrai, you just play Yveltal. Now we don't have to worry about Lightning weakness because Joltik's gone, and so is Mega Manectric. Obviously, if people are worried about Rayquaza, then people will automatically be countering you anyway by playing like Raichu or Zebstrika, those sorts of cards. But even then, I think Yveltal EX is just so inherently strong, it can still win those games with a thick enough Zoroark line. Obviously, Gallade was thrown in there to try and help you with type coverage, but if it's low enough HP things like Zebstrika and Raichu, you don't really need those sorts of buffs. You don't need a fighting type to get over them, so you can just trade one for one with Zoroark pieces. But yeah, I think this deck will remain on the top tables, in and around there, because such inherently strong cards. It loses a few things, like you can see there, but I think it can definitely manage without these cards. So moving on, we are up to Mega Sceptile, and I've put him as thriving because I think look at what he loses. I mean, he loses AZ and Super Scoop Up. And I know Super Scoop Up used to be like a 4 of for this deck when I did well with it way back when at the start of the season. I had 4 Super Scoop Up and it was the cornerstone of the deck. Now that we have stuff like Fisherman, we can just pay Retreat and Jagged Saber Chain that way instead. Just get more into the hand every turn instead and allow Jagged Saber to do the work. So really, I think Mega Sceptile is fairly unchanged. It doesn't lose much at all. Only really gains the threat of the Volcanion EX. Obviously being a fire type, that's going to be an issue for you. And there's also other one-hit KO variants. I remember Mega Rayquaza was never the easiest. It was trying to be a Stadium War. That was your only real win condition as a Sceptile player. But it was never nice. And there are other one-hit KO things out there. And as soon as you start one-hit KOing, clearly as a tanking deck, you're not going to be too happy about that. So those are the issues for Sceptile. But really, I think he loses very little. And he's already, an okay deck. Normally people see him as an anti-meta deck just when Greninja's really hyped. But he's strong enough. And definitely in a format where there's a lot more EXs, a lot less non-EX decks around. There's going to be a lot of 2-hit KO trading. Definitely 220 HP is a huge amount to get over. So a lot of the time when you're up against other EXs, you can just win by going for slow Jagged Sabers every turn, but healing off the damage they're doing to you. And think about how awkward that would be for the likes of Darkrai decks, Yveltal decks, just a lot of different EXs out there that can't handle Mega Sceptile too nicely. Like I say, unless they're hitting for weakness or can get over 220 in a turn. But that is very few cards out there right now. So Mega Sceptile, maybe it's his time. Who knows? On to Mega Rayquaza. Just mentioned him a second ago. But he is, a lot of people are tipping him off to be the new frontrunner of Standard. I really don't think he's going to be. Because there's a lot of things that can really hurt Mega Rayquaza. But I can definitely see its power is there. It's like Night March in terms of its turn 1 potential and how speedy it can be. It can use that evolution trait to get into the Mega turn 1 and use that huge Emerald Break for 30 times the number of your own bench Pokemon. Clearly it's big damage. We have Hooper, we have Shaman. Those haven't gone anywhere. The only things it loses are really techie cards like Xerosic, AZ. Compressor it only ever really played like a 1 or 2 off to try and get your techie supporters in the discard pile, as well as Mega Turbo potential. And Sacred Ash, we don't really mind that going because we have Karen anyway. It also gains Ranger, so you don't have to play techie Pokemon. You can just be as straight and speedy as possible, which is pretty cool. And we have Special Charge as well to recover double colorless, so that Energy Denial is a lot less of an option. So Mega Rayquaza looks like it has set itself up to be a very great deck, but it's going to be one of these things where as soon as it's got a target on its head as public enemy number 1, best deck in format, then the counters come out, and Mega Rayquaza does have a handful of counters to be sure. Raichu, I remember playing Raichu a couple of years ago at Nationals because Mega Rayquaza was hyped at the time, and I never lost to Rayquaza. It's just so easy. The same thing for Zebstrika. Zebstrika's been a tech that we've seen in a couple of Vespiquen variants. It too, for just a double colorless, can deal with Mega Rayquaza quite nicely. There's obviously Altaria though, so it's not out of the question that these Ray players are just playing Altaria to try and win these sorts of matchups. But there's also more abstract things like Parallel City can be a real pain. You probably have to find your Stadium replacement and Karen and then search out Pokemon all in one turn to try and get back up to a good amount of damage. And also Giratina EX, still going to be strong in the Darkrai Tina builds. He can really pose a threat to the Mega Rayquaza because if you can combine it with something like an Enhanced Hammer, I know it's not often played in the Darkrai Giratina decks, but you can prevent the Rayquaza from attaching the double colorless or replacing the Stadium, and they could Pokemon Ranger to attack, but if they don't have the energy, they can't do it. So they have to Hex, but they have to have the right energy and the right damage on the board to be able to do that. So if you time a Giratina correctly by either replacing the Stadium at the time or denying their energy at the time so that they can't one-hit the Giratina, then it's going to be a real pain for the Rayquaza players. So that's still a threat out there. So plenty of things to be concerned about as the Ray player, but it truly is one of the speediest and most hard-hitting decks we have in Standard these days. Next up is Volcanion, onto the Steam Siege sort of cards. It's weird to say that it's losing things before I've even played with this deck. I've started to proxy a Volcanion list, but I know that Blacksmith is going to be an absolutely huge loss for this deck. Part of its strength right now is that you can get these sorts of attacks, like you can see on the EX, Volcanic Heat. You could do it on turn 1, and that sort of raw pace and power is what makes it good right now. So it's going to be more of a bit of a setup deck when we look at it post-rotation, where we're using a lot more. The emphasis will be on the non-EX Volcanion, trying to set up multiple attackers on the bench with just the attack alone, without Blacksmith, maybe some Max Elixirs in the equation as well. But losing Battle Compressor is another big hit. Obviously it combined mostly with Blacksmith in the first place, so not too big of a deal. But I know current builds are most likely playing Compressor right now. AZ and Xerosic, I keep throwing these in combined, but really because they have a lot of chunky retreat costs, the Volcanion deck. Obviously Ninja Boy's an option, but it's still a pain, and Xerosic because, you know, it's all based around the steam up ability, and Garbodor can be an issue for you, so losing the likes of tool removal is a pain. So like you can see, the biggest threat is probably Garbodor. Just Garbodor builds will just out-hit you as the Volcanion player, I think, because the inherent damage isn't strong enough. It all is backed up by the steam up ability, and if you can't do that, you're probably going to lose a lot of games. So something to look out for Volcanion. It loses a lot of speed post-rotation, and without a way to deal with Garbodor, I don't think it has the power anymore either, so I think it's got a very niche window to do well. It'll be interesting to see if it can show up for Worlds. I think at the moment I can't see how it beats Night March, so I think it's one of these things where you sort of have to bide your time for Volcanion. It looks like it's going to be great, but then post-rotation it loses so much, and it can't deal with Garbodor too nicely, other than Lysander KOing it and praying. I guess that's always an option for any deck, but it doesn't seem too great overall, so it's going to be interesting to see how this card survives in the future. Next up is Mega Gardevoir. I'm personally a big fan of this card, even with Dimension Valley going. I guess you could also argue Mystery Energy could have been put on this guy. Also Aromatisse could have been used. Maybe a split of both Mega Gardevoirs could have been cool if Aromatisse was still around, where you have this for the early turns, and then when you build up a good amount of energy, you could use the other Mega Gardevoir. Could have been cool to see, but without Aromatisse, I don't see it working too nicely. But really, I think this is a pretty good Pokemon. Even with just Mega Turbo and a single attachment, it's very efficiently costed. It reminds me of Mega Manectric a lot, with that 110 base damage as well. Despair Ray can get rid of all the easy knockouts on the bench, so your opponent is forced to go through all of your big Mega Pokemon, and in other matchups where you're against other people's EXs, you can try and use stuff like Horlucha or just Lysander to take the easier prizes, like the Shaman EXs, the Hoopers and stuff like that, because remember, we're a Psychic type, so we can also hit for weakness on Hooper for nice, easy one-hit KOs. So Gardevoir looks like it's pretty cool in a field where there's a lot of EXs, and because it's variable damage output, you're probably good against non-EX decks as well, because 110 is a good baseline for like stage 1s, but also when you're looking at stage 2 decks, you can increase your output accordingly. So Mega Gardevoir looks like it has a lot of potential. I like its typing as well. A few people are hyping Mewtwo, and if anyone wants to try out Alakazam in the new meta, Mega Gardevoir could stomp it thanks to typing. And it's got a fantastic weakness right now of Metal. So post-rotation, Bronzong's gone, so pretty much Metal is obsolete right now. So this is amazing for Gardevoir. You essentially have no weakness, and you have resistance to Dark, which is one of the most relevant types in the format right now. So there's so much that I like about Mega Gardevoir. I think it's going to be perfect post-rotation. This is the one I want to try out the most. On to Mega Steelix. I said at the start of the video that it's kind of, why am I really showing this? I'm not certain that it's even going to be good in the first place. It could just be this rogue that you never see play, but I thought it's still worth mentioning while the format's still new. We're still testing out these cards. We don't know how good Mega Steelix is going to be. And with a lot less speedy non-EX decks, it does tend to favour Mega Steelix's playstyle, where you're trying to tank and do big numbers. It does lose a few things, mainly its fighting side of things, where you can't have Fighting Stadium, and you can't have Karina to search out the Mega anymore. Losing Xerosic AZ, I guess it's a bit of a pain. If we are using, I'm imagining that Clawitz is going to be the main partner for Mega Steelix, so having nothing to do with Garbodor again is going to be an issue. We don't have Bronzong, but again, I prefer Clawitzer anyway. A few threats, again, Volcanion, if it does do well, it's going to pose a threat to Mega Steelix. And again, Garbodor because of our reliance on Clawitzer. Obviously, it does depend on the matchup though. If you can get the first Steelix out early, before they develop Garb, you can either Lysander and it's never going to be an issue, or you can just allow one to tank you for a few EXs. I can see him out-hitting the likes of Darkrai, the likes of Yveltal, even with his high energy cost, just because his HP is huge, shield energy is a thing, and he can tank. This guy's huge. Don't underestimate 240 HP, it's absolutely massive, and his attack is not great, but we do still have strong energy at least, so he can dish out one-hit KOs, no problem. So it's going to be interesting to see if Mega Steelix can work in a metagame rife with EX decks. At least that's how I'm picturing it right now. I know that as long as there's a lot of EX decks in format, that's when non-EXs seem appealing, but at the moment I feel like the rise of EXs is really coming back because we can't deal with the things like fighting Fury Belt, so regular EXs are huge, and it just seems to bode well that you can fit in a Garbodor line in some of these EX decks because, you just have the space for these sorts of things. So I think Mega Steelix is one to keep an eye on. Next up is Xerneas Break. This is a pretty interesting card. I think its biggest loss is Aromatisse, but other than that, I think it's pretty untouched. It still has Max Elixir, it has EXP share, so trying to get a huge attack off, where it's 20 times the amount of Fair Energy on your entire board, seems pretty viable. Obviously, they can't deny your tools anymore. They can't get rid of EXP shares very easily, so it's likely that if you have bench-sitting things with EXP shares on, they don't have to be Regirocks anymore. They can just be any Pokemon, just loads of Xerneas. You try and be as quick as possible, get this out as a fake stage 1 basically, with 150 HP is really big. You have the resistance to Dark as well. That's a huge factor right now in the format. Like I was saying with Mega Gardevoir, the resistance is going to be big because I think Dark decks are also going to be big. So its attack is decent. You have two very good Xerneases that can sit underneath this guy. You have Rainbow Road potentially, and you also have just Geomancy that's going to help you set up in the early game in the first place. So a lot of energy can get onto the board quickly, and by turn 2 you can be doing huge numbers with this. And as a non-EX with that sort of HP, I can see it pulling its weight in the format for sure. Definitely one I want to try out. Next up is Yanmega stuff. I think this is really going to take the role of Vespiquen right now. I think because Karen's a thing, because we lose Battle Compressor, Yanmega's more of the sort of grass-type splashable thing that we want these days. It looks a lot more appealing than Vespiquen does at the moment. It already has free retreat as well. It can hit similar numbers to the Vespiquen in the early turns, which is important for that early aggression if you are trying to use the likes of Forest of Giant Plants. If you want him to be more of a main stage and then just have other techs around him, maybe have Zebstrika, Raichu, Zoroark, these sorts of things in the background while Yanmega takes center stage, that could also be an interesting line to go for. A few losses. The regular Yanmega's attack is based on if they have a tool attached. I was just saying that tools cannot be removed, so there will be a lot of tools around in the format, but we can't force this. That means we can't put Headringer on or Jamming Net on EX Pokemon, which would be amazing for Yanmega in post-rotation. It would be so cool to do these things, but it's not an option for us, which is a problem. We do lose Muscle Band, so hitting a flat 100 is fine. Hitting a flat 50 is not fine. If they're playing around with their tools, that's going to be an issue for you. Battle Compressor going is annoying just because we can't use Revitalizer as like a search tool alongside Compressor, so I thought I'd throw that in there. The only threat again is Garbodor. I've said so many times that Garbodor's a threat. He's currently a threat in the format, but when he can't be checked, he's just so annoying. And think about Yanmega, where it's not like you can just Lysander and knock out Garbodor, because it means you would have to have 3 energy attached to you to be able to do those things, and you really don't want to do that if you're a Yanmega player. You want to be attacking for free every turn. That's the whole point. That's why you're playing Yanmega, so I think more than most, Yanmega will struggle against Garb, so that's a bit of an issue for him. And finally, the decks that have sort of been in and around the format for a little while now, that have never really hit the top tables. I know some of you may argue with some of these picks. I know Groudon's been good for a time. There was a small period where Mewtwo did well at the ECC. Zygarde has started to pick up a little bit of results here and there. But really, these have been on the fringes. They've not been great for long, if they ever have been fantastic. But They've always seemed to have potential, and as soon as the card pool reduces in any type of card game, you have to think about the power level of the entire field decreasing. So some of these decks that were previously not good enough for these sorts of reasons, X, Y, Z, whatever it is, now those reasons may not be apparent. For example, Rainbow Force, the Rainbow Road deck always seemed to have too much setup, and you'd always lose up to the decks like Night March, and Item Lock would also be a pain for you. But those things are gone, and Rainbow Force is still a really big attack. It's like you're playing Mega Rayquaza, but you're a non-EX. We have the likes of Mega Turbo to set these up. We have Hooper that can now get Volcanion, which is dual type, so we can hit harder a lot easier and a lot quicker. So there's a lot going right for Rainbow Road post-rotation. I think it might be one that we have to explore. There's also the Break evolution, of course, that we could use to buff our HP, or we already have Fighting Fury Belt, which can't get removed, so 160 HP on a non-EX sounds pretty dirty. There's a lot of good things here, so Xerneas could be big. Zygarde, we do lose a few pieces, like the Karina, like the Fighting Stadium. We also lose Magnetic Storm, which is annoying, but there's still a few resisting Pokemon in format. There's still the Rayquaza, there's Yveltal, Baby Yveltal, Shaman, of course, so not having a nice stadium for the fighting deck may put you off. But at the same time, like I was saying, it seems to be, a lot of the decks I've discussed have been EX decks, so having All Cells Burn basically being like the old school builds of Rizin Genesect and Carbink looking so much more appealing with less non-EX decks around. Zygarde, it could be his time as well, so that would be interesting to see how that plays out. Mega Alakazam, I still think he's never going to be too good. I think a few issues are going out the way, like the Aquabox deck, the Manectric decks, all of these sorts of rough seas focused builds are leaving the format, as well as Night March, clearly that's going, so there's a lot to be excited about if you're a Mega Alakazam fan, but at the same time you lose Super Scoop Up, you lose AZ, these two cards were pretty integral. You're basically left with just Devo Spray, and that's so much less efficient, I think, than Super Scoop Up ever would be, so that's a bit of a shame, but it'd be fun to test out Zam all over again. Mega Mewtwo as well, one that's done good in the past for small amounts of time if you predict the meta to not have much Night March, or if you can just avoid Night March in certain tournaments. You can take down tournaments just because damage change is so good, and pair it with the Mega, it can put out big damage with its attack. So really good stuff. The Primals as well, they've come in and out of popularity. Mainly Groudon's looked good, but like I was saying, in these matchups where you're just slamming up against big EXs, there's no one better than Groudon. Even without Focus Sash and Hard Charm, I think just his big damage is good. Gaia Volcano still good output. There's a lot that I still like about Groudon, and Wobbuffet's still going to be a pain for a lot of decks, so that's good to see. Kyogre as well, just the healing, dealing with Megas is great for Tidal Storm. It's what the attack's meant to do. You can take nice Lysander knockouts. We have Hawlucha as well, which improves Primal Kyogre's ability to take 2-hit KOs on EXs by doing the initial 30 damage, then 150, or the other way around. You can sometimes take 4 prizes in a turn, which would be pretty interesting. And the final card I want to talk about is actually Magnezone. These sorts of Rain Dance Pokemon have usually been good in the format at some point, and with a lot of Item Lock going and Night March going, maybe it's Magnezone's time. Do bear in mind that we can't deal with Garbodor very well at all, but other than Garb, if you can deal with Garbodor in one way or another, there are certain attackers that could be great for Magnezone. Raikou's an option, of course. We have Kingdra EX, which isn't too shabby, and just having the spam of energy. We have Energy Pouch, we have Fisherman, we have Energy Retrieval, so many different ways that we can get energy back. It seems like if you set this guy up in a lot of matchups, you could be sitting quite happy, to be honest. So it'd be interesting to see if people actually try out Magnezone post-rotation, because Rain Dance has been a thing throughout the game since the beginning, and we've lost a few energy accelerators. We've lost Mega Manectric, we've lost Bronzong, so it's going to be interesting to see if people actually pick up and go with this guy. It could also act like the Bronzong deck, where it combined Energy Excel with Max Elixir anyway, just for early acceleration. That way you're less weak to Garbodor, and obviously without Item Lock you can do that pretty carefree. So that would be cool to see. So a lot of food for thought, guys. I hope you really enjoyed this video where we've gone over a few of the top decks and a few fringe decks just now as well. Let me know what you guys think about the rotation, and let me know your favourite card that you're going to be missing a lot. For me, it's going to be Super Scoop Up. Love that card. Love flipping coins and winning games because of it. And I'm happy to see Night March go, to be honest. It's been a pace setter for the format since it really began. I guess not when it had to use Mew EX to keep up, but definitely the last 6 to 8 months, it has really dominated the format in terms of just setting the speed, setting a goal that every other deck has to at least have a good Night March matchup to compete in the format. It really is a testament to how good that deck was, and I really think it's good that we can finally say goodbye to that deck. So let me know the cards you're sad to see going. Let me know the favourite thing that you never have to play against again. That is a bit of a loaded question towards Night March, but it could also be Seismitoad. So let me know your thoughts about the rotation. Let me know if I missed anything, any important cards going, any decks that I've missed out on, just your reaction to the rotation. I'd love to hear your comments down below. Join the discussion, and like the video if you did. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and it has been Joe from OmniPoke, and I will see you guys next time.